Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the ET EY ESG Leadership Dialogues. We started this 6-episode series with Economic Times to facilitate engaging conversations with business leaders around various aspects of ESG. To bring about greater level of clarity on this subject. In the past 5 editions, we covered various themes such as value creation, decarbonization, circular economy, governance, and social well-being. For this concluding session of the series, today, we have come together to discuss opportunities and challenges for companies as they imbibe the ESG agenda into their business. Here I would like to quote Rabindranath Tagore. You can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. Let me repeat. You can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. With this, I would like to welcome our panel of distinguished business leaders who lead large businesses and at the same time are very passionate about the subject of ESG. And all of them are walking the talk today, but today we would like to have them talk the walk to inspire us all. With that, let me welcome each of my panel members. To begin with, Mr. Nadir Godrej. And Nadir is also the co-chair of Godrej Good and Green Governing Council. He's deeply committed to the group's good and green strategies and achievement of set targets for the Godrej Group. He's also a member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Welcome, Mr. Godrej, to this esteemed panel. Next, Julie Teagland, EY's Area Managing Partner for EMEA. In this role, Julie provides leadership for EY member firms across 97 countries. She is also a big proponent of ESG, and we will all benefit from her experience on both regulatory developments and adoption of change to bring ESG to life in the EU. She's also very passionate about diversity and inclusion agenda. Welcome, Julie, to this panel. Next, Kalyan Ram, Chief Operating Officer, Birla Cellulose Limited. In his role, and also because of his personal passion for the subject, Kalyan has been driving a lot of change at Birla Cellulose to build the business practices to achieve ESG goals covering decarbonization, water, and social dimensions. Welcome, Kalyan, and great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Zarir Langrana, Executive Director and President of Global Chemicals Business at Tata Chemicals. Zarir is responsible for the operations and growth of its inorganic chemicals business globally and its new venture in specialty chemicals focused on nutraceuticals and specialty silicas. He's also a strong advocate of ESG and is driving a lot of change on ESG through supply chain initiatives in a very hard to abate chemical industry. So look forward, Zarir, to hearing your thoughts on how you're doing it at hard to abate industry. Welcome. Navneet Manot, Managing Director and CEO of SDFC Asset Management. Navneet has over 28 years of rich experience in financial markets across asset classes. He has been a pioneer in ESG investing in India and would like to hear your thoughts, Navneet, on how capital markets will drive ESG agenda. Thanks once again to all of you for joining us today. We all look forward to learning from your insights, thoughts, and experience. Now let me open the discussion with the first question for Mr. Godrej. Mr. Godrej, slowly but surely, examples of transformative corporate actions are emerging. And you have been driving this in the Godrej Group through good and green initiatives. So may I request you to please share some of these positive examples which are driving the real change on the ground.
Thank you. ESG is not just a cost. It shouldn't be seen as profits lost. Now, businesses do realize that profit is a short-term prize. And after all, what do companies gain if they die out and don't sustain? But how much can they afford to spend to ensure their existence doesn't end? The answer is not easy to find, but a thought still comes to my mind. If the efforts of all are combined, the synergies that we can find reduces costs and raises gain and obviates inevitable pain. There's a capitalistic strain that enthrones shareholder gain, and Milton Friedman could see that this simplistic philosophy could lead to great efficiency. But wherever there's externality, this capitalism, red in tooth and claw, can prove to be a dismal flaw. Correction can come from regulation or even from self-remediation. And Adam Smith himself foresaw that business would address this flaw. It should be clearly understood. One can do well by doing good. Doing it smartly, we do better. So why not be the trendsetter? In capitalism early days, we see social responsibility in some degree to dissipate the urban gloom. Both Cadbury, Lord Leverhulme, then pioneered the company town. It's time to get the Tata Group now very much into the loop. Because it seemed morally right, the Tata Group then set its sight at such a very lofty height for what trade unions had to fight in Europe for several years was gifted by these worthy seers. From the goodness of their heart, undoubtedly this played a part in honing their great reputation and then contributing to the nation. And doing good is very sound. What goes around does come around. My grandfather probably saw these examples and found no flaw. He bought far away marshy land. His critics just couldn't understand. They concluded he had gone quite mad. But today, we're glad, not sad. A township then slowly arose, and this is where our business grows. We provided every needed tool, housing, hospital, and school. My uncle, known as Sorabji, way back could clearly see the environment was under stress. Neglect, he knew, would be a mess. Our creekside land was reserved, the mangroves there well preserved, and from my office I gaze out there, a Mumbai view that's very rare, with greenery all the way until New Bombay. In Worldwide Fund, he played a role. Saving the tiger was his goal. One day, I hope you will enter the Sorabji Godrej Green Center, where CII and Godrej sought to perpetuate his noble thought. And here I think we all ought to pay careful heed to Michael Porter. With shared value, there's no cost for doing good, as nothing's lost. All it takes is a thinking brain to remove a societal pain and combine it with a business gain to create a sustainable chain of endless mutual benefit. This concept is a tremendous hit. We thought that we should also try and see if we could apply this philosophy to our group. Our employees also joined the loop. In the year 2010, studies were commissioned, and then, with the help of DASRA and FSG, our new program, one could see, we aptly named it Good and Green, and what a journey it has been. And how do we define our role? What could be a proper goal? Good health through perfect sanitation, environment and education, all of these can be seen in our program, Good and Green. And so without partiality, our goal for all is neutrality, whether water, carbon, or solid waste. And very soon we will make haste to make our net emissions zero. Will that make the group a hero? In 2010, the goal looked tall, but we took a reasoned call. Technology would save the day. So far, it has turned out that way. To achieve these goals, we will strive to do it all by 2025. As technology takes a leap, green energy gets very cheap. Keen observers quickly saw that solar also tracks Moore's law. Whether groundnut shell or bagasse, our India's full of biomass. And bamboo now is on the way, a major role it can play. At first, we thought we'd have to spend, but that's not true, for in the end, the more we thought and the more we slaved, we did invest, but we also saved. And solar is still getting cheaper. And as we start digging deeper, soon it will hit the goal of being cheaper than even coal. There are many paths that we can see for achieving carbon neutrality. The cheapest way is certainly through energy efficiency. Real interest rates are rather low and high returns quickly flow for any energy saving device. For business, this is very nice. In India, mandated CSR can help us go very far. Multiple benefits is what one sees with water projects or growing trees. Good livelihoods are created. Our carbon emissions are abated. Trees planted at a river source maintain the flow throughout its course. So many benefits we can see. The preservation of biodiversity. Different species can be tried. Useful products can be supplied, like biomass or edible fruits. And yet, the trunk and the roots can sequester carbon, clean the air, a win-win that is very fair. So while we decarbonize, why not also monetize? Some companies are not yet sold. For some, it's tough. Or so I'm told. Energy-intensive firms would say it's tougher then for them to play. If you can turn all waste to gold, and if you can be very bold with inventing technology, any industry can see eventual neutrality. And there is so much more to gain if it's across our entire chain. Now, COVID opened up our eyes. Let's hope we've become quite wise. We saw the benefits of green, but something else was also seen. The different outcomes we could see because of inequality. Can COVID then act as a spur? Now, couldn't it help to stir our hearts and minds to newer heights with ESG now in our sights? The vision that we should now share is a brave new world, both green and fair. The environment isn't all. On society, let's take a call. Throughout the chain, let's keep in sight every person's human right. It's business as usual, not bravery, to end child labor and slavery. And all businesses, we should see the broadest reach of diversity. Not only is it fair and right, it will give us the best insight. Since life is full of many hard knocks, we need to think out of the box. Diversity is the perfect aid when we are required to wade through troubled waters or quagmires. Unusual thought is what inspires. Lack of health and education leads to the perpetuation of inequality through generations in almost all of our nations. Without good health, you never learn. If you don't learn, you cannot earn. For health, as well as climate change, it certainly isn't strange that prevention's better than a cure. On public health, we should spend. It is much cheaper in the end. With little cost and greatest ease, we could reduce lifestyle disease. At any rate, I'm quite sure we would spend less than for a cure. In order to achieve this goal, businesses should play a role. Through business models and CSR, together we can go quite far. And similarly, through education, we can serve ourselves and the nation. Through action and advocacy, we can help all humanity to create a world that's just and fair, and everyone is free to share nature's bounty and be fulfilled. And then I'm sure we'd all be thrilled. Ingeniously, we can plan it, serve profit, people, and planet. Sustainability is not a pain, for after all, it is a gain. It helps us all to survive, last long as well as to thrive. It's a license to operate. The ecosystem finds it great. Society, governments, banks cooperate, convey their thanks. With ESG spends, nothing's lost, as benefits outweigh the cost. And governance also pays. It's an effort in the early days, but over time you are rewarded. Implicit trust is awarded. The values for which you stand help to enhance your brand. Must persist and never balk. Consistently walk the talk. If your governance is strong, the payback won't be very long. Always keep these facts in sight. Don't hesitate to do what's right. The strategy is tried and tested. In the long haul, it can't be bested. Now, ESG will take you far. Don't just be a shooting star, rising high before you fall. Instead, take the enduring call. All of us can forge ahead if we only learn to shed the barriers that can divide, and if cooperation's tried, with the help of business, I foresee a helpful, thriving society. Thank you.
That's very good. Very good. I think, Mr. Godrej, you very well covered all aspects of ESG impact and put it very nicely in a poem. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're most welcome.
Let me move to Julie. So how are the companies in the EU region looking at ESG from a value creation perspective? If you can share your thoughts in terms of what's happening in the EU.
I'd be honored and happy to, but I'm afraid I won't be able to meet the quality of the speech that I just heard from Mr. Godrej. It was very impressive, and I would be very delighted if you would share that after this session. Pankaj, if I come back to your question, I actually think Mr. Godrej also covered this. I see two major issues across the EU. Most companies are transitioning rapidly to try to be compliant with the many EU regulations that are out there. You all know that the European Union has been leading the globe in terms of regulation. Now, sometimes that's not considered a very positive thing. When it comes to ESG, it is considered positive, but companies are really racing to ensure that they can meet the disclosure requirements, the requirements on needing to meet those goals and publish their plans, including the plastic tax, the carbon emissions border adjustments, as well as the reporting requirements. And I would say that was the real first wave that we saw, Pankaj, across the EU. It's been followed up now quickly by a wave of what I call sustainable and a value-led driven conversation. Most EU companies, once they feel that they've got at least an approach on the compliance, they're now moving quickly to really assessing how they can leverage their need to transition to winning much more in the market. And so you see companies looking, how can ESG and leveraging their ESG steps allow them to attract new customers, allow them to effectively accelerate innovation, and thirdly, help them redesign their supply chain. And there is a huge focus, I would say right now, across the EU in all matters concerning supply chain, not just from an ESG perspective, but that's clearly accelerated by an ESG perspective. Pankaj, if you allow me just one more statement, I really believe that we've seen a change in Europe. I think most successful CEO and business leaders, and Mr. Godrej, you covered this as well, most successful CEOs and business leaders understand now that sustainability has to play a role in their strategy. It's not just icing on the cake, it needs to be baked in, and it needs to really unlock longer term goals by being driven or at least supported at the board level. And I think that's a major change that we've seen in the last 12 months, Pankaj. I would close with those comments. Anchor it at the board level, make sure it's embedded in the strategy. Yes, there is a race for compliance, but fourthly, make sure that you're leveraging it to win in the market. And that could be on the customer side or on the supply chain side.
Very well said, Julie. I think we have to move from compliance to real action on the ground. And that real action will come only if it gets the real importance at the board level. So unless I think this is being driven by the board, and I think I'll come in the end to executive compensation, because that's also a linkage to that is very important to drive the real change. So with that, I think just one more question, Julie, for you. How are the sourcing strategies of EU companies changing such that this can benefit companies in India and other developing markets to sell to EU, right? Because I think if they bring about change in supply chain, that creates an opportunity for companies in the other parts of the world to sell into EU.
I do. I think you're absolutely right, Pankaj. Sourcing models are changing. Supply chains are being redesigned. And that's a real opportunity for India and India companies to get involved, to be part of that. If you think about it, old roads are being torn up and newly established. I would maybe highlight 4 things and a few recommendations, if you allow. I'll start with my my 4 points. I think across EU companies are looking for a much greater transparency of the supply chain, the ability to track and drive authenticity, including the supply for key raw materials. I think they're looking to de-risk the supply base, look at alternative sources, and move more supply across the board for those stocking critical components with a greater level of flexibility and capacity. And they're looking to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions across their supply base. So if companies are looking across, they really want to be able to prove that they're doing that. We see one, and that would be my fourth comment, we see one really interesting development. We notice that there's been much more industry peering and pairing across the board in the EU than ever before. We understand if they're looking to drive down those greenhouse gas emissions, no one company can do it alone. And I often cite Unilever as an example. They're the biggest palm oil purchaser across the world, but they still only own 3% of the global production. Those companies are coming together now to form alliances and consortiums to really look at how they can drive specific commodities effectively to jointly sponsor the re-engineering of the full supply chain. And that's a development, Pankaj, we haven't seen before. We see a lot more collaboration in that respect. And that's really having an impact on how companies should look to deal with the EU. And that would bring me to my couple of points of advice, if you allow. I really think it's important, obviously, across supply chain, keep your focus on operational excellence. That's always going to be clear. But you also want to be able to demonstrate that your tier suppliers are known and monitored effectively from a risk and ESG perspective. The EU directives is going to hold the EU company responsible and accountable for this. And so you've got to be able to demonstrate that, making sure that you can demonstrate a robust ESG program around sustainable supply chain and sourcing, that you've got goals, metrics, measurement, processes, and improvement initiatives that are aligned with European ESG regulations and beyond. That's going to be very, very helpful for the future. And you probably want to consider proactively publishing an ESG impact report. That's one of the things that companies are including now on their list of supplier qualifications. That's one thing you might want to consider. And I would recommend, Pankaj, maybe as a last one, to monitor what's happening across the EU in terms of the regulation and tax changes involving ESG, because it's increasingly becoming one of their threshold activities to be included in the supply chain, that they test and understand that you know what's going on in that market. My last comment is a positive one. I do think with all going on, there's a real opportunity to leverage innovation across this. And I know that companies are really looking, EU companies specifically, looking for demonstrated innovation across that supply chain to help them reach the best answers. I think those would be my comments, Pankaj. I hope it's not too much of a laundry list. I know it seems like there's a lot to do, but I think this is in line with what Mr. Godrej said. It's for the best interest of us all.
So that is true, Julie. And I think technology can play a significant role here. I was at a session this morning, and I think they talked about how using technology we can monitor in terms of what we are doing, and then take corrective actions, and abatement processes can start. So I think it's very important to bring in technology into this equation. And
I fully agree. And innovation, my friend.
Absolutely.
And innovation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie, for your comments. Zarir, if I can just get you in here, you play both global and India role, and how do you see changing preferences in global and more advanced markets driving companies to make change? Because you sell into those companies. Would appreciate if you could share some examples of how Tata Chemicals is imbibing the ESG agenda in its business.
Sure. Pankaj, thanks for that. And as always, Mr. Godrej is a very hard act to follow in terms of the comprehensiveness of his coverage. Past, present, future. He's really cut across the swath of issues on ESG. So, Pankaj, coming to your question, let me just reframe and clarify that even if we weren't a global company supplying into global markets, even if we were domestic and addressing only local markets, I think we would have done what needed to be done as far as ESG is concerned. And I believe as long as we are driven by global and advanced economies to do what needs to be done, I think we might be unwilling travelers on this journey. We need to do this because we believe it's the right thing to do. And it's heartening that many corporates here in India today, across sectors, and more importantly, I think at the national level, believe that it's the right thing to do. And we are seeing that reflected in action, in the new policies that are being discussed and rolled out. And I think essentially this is being driven by customers, stakeholders, financial bodies, obviously the regulators, but more importantly, the community. I think this has to be people and community-centric if we really wanted to make a difference. And very soon, this is going to be our license to operate across industries, across sectors. It's going to be table stakes if you want to do business anywhere in the world. So the question is not going to be any longer why, but how soon? And more importantly, can it even be sooner? And while it might give us some short-term competitive advantage, but longer term, this is no longer an option. I don't think, as Julie mentioned, this is any longer about a bolt-on to strategy. It's at the core of strategy for all companies across the world. And certainly, I don't think any of us underestimate the challenge of doing this, whether it's technology, financing, the regulations that are quickly being put into place. All of this throws up new areas and new challenges. But I think it's all part of the evolution. And we've seen the tremendous progress that's been made on these journeys by many corporates in these last few years. And I think this will just pick up pace. We in the chemical sector, as you're aware, Pankaj, we are a hard-to-abate sector, right? But
yes,
I also
it's very hard.
Yeah, I also believe that we are part of the solution and a very important part of the solution. I don't think there is any sustainability solution out there today that doesn't in some way lean upon chemistry or the chemical industry to be part of that solution, right? Within Tata Chemicals itself, our own product portfolio today addresses many application sectors that really are driving this, whether it's in the processing of lithium for EVs and batteries, whether it's the manufacture of solar glass, whether it's providing emission control solutions, whether it's providing green tires for the new generation of commercial and passenger vehicles. I think increasingly, we are seeing a positive skew that we are giving to our portfolio selection of products, and that offers solutions to the ESG challenge. I think also it's inextricably today tied on into our decision making, whether it's putting CapEx on the ground, operational improvements. I think a basic filter that we are using for all new projects is, does it meet some very basic ESG criteria? We also have baked into our decision-making a explicit internal carbon price to kind of guide us on our decision-making, and we use that to, filter out projects that need to be done or not need to be done. In terms of what we've done on the ground and what the key elements of our journey is, I think on the ESG bit, there is a little proactive, increased emphasis on the E and the S of the ESG, as far as we are concerned. If I look at environment, really three broad pillars that we are focusing on. One is around climate change, the second is around circular economy, and the third is around nature and biodiversity. On climate change, about 2 years ago, we were among the few Indian companies, and certainly the first Indian chemical company that signed up to the SBTi. We've taken a committed, published target of cutting 30% emission by 2030. And this is absolute emission, not specific emissions. We've taken a target of growing to net zero by 2045, slightly more ambitious target. We've, on that journey, a year ago, commissioned in our UK operation, the UK's first and largest industrial scale carbon capture and usage unit. We capture CO2 from our cogeneration utility to produce sodium bicarbonate, and that captures approximately 50,000 tons of CO2 per annum. If you look at what we're doing around circular economy, and there the focus is really on water and waste. Today, 90% of our water across our sites globally are recycled. We have a target to go to 100% in the next 3 years and make all our sites net water neutral, but more importantly, a commitment to drawing zero groundwater. The total waste material that we use today is close to 500,000 tons per annum. Our fly ash usage is 100%. On nature and biodiversity, this is something that we've been focused on for many, many years. Really, most of what we do is drawn out of seawater. Most of our sites are coastal in nature. We've planted over 115,000 mangroves in these last 5 years. Excuse me. About 250 hectares of mangrove plantations, coral transplantations across the coast where we operate. We have a very focused program that we've been running for this last decade in conjunction with the Wildlife Trust of India on whale sharks. We've rescued close to 1,000 whale sharks around the Gujarat coast. And these are the 3 areas that I think we will continue to focus on with very ambitious targets to get to where we need to be over the next 5 years. In terms of what we're doing on community engagement, really the focus is around lives and livelihoods. About 80,000 people covered under our affirmative action program. We have about 36,000, close to 40,000 women covered last year under various empowerment programs and self-help groups focused on this. A similar number of youth and students being supported on skills, online classes, and employability, and about 20,000 families and people covered under nutrition and safe drinking water programs, all in and around our manufacturing sites. So that's where we are in terms of doing what we need to do. I think unless people start making a commitment, even if you don't know how you're going to get to where you want to go, you need to start the journey. And pathways will emerge, technologies will emerge. And more importantly, I think the ecosystem and your partners that you work with are going to be drawn towards you because they are progressing on those same journeys. So I'm going to take a pause there, Pankaj, and open it up to the other panelists.
Very good example of very good example, Sari, in terms of how you are imbibing ESG into your corporate strategy and bringing about change on the ground, and not just on one aspect of ESG. I think you talked about you're doing it both on E and S. There's a disproportionate focus. Tata Group is known for G already. So I think I'm saying that G is given. So that's a great story, Sari, in terms of how you're bringing about both E and S. Because Julie, I think in Europe, it's mostly right now concentrated on E, right? And I think we need to focus more on S as well. And S and G as well. So great stories, Ari. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let me move to Kalyan. Kalyan, how are you driving change on the ground on your ESG agenda? Because you're also very passionate about ESG as Ari is. Okay, and specifically, if you can touch upon in terms of supply chain, how you're driving that change in the supply chain of yours, your company.
Yeah, thanks, Pankaj. I'm clearly elated to be among such diverse thought leaders. Mr. Godrej inspired here with the poetic way to explain ESG. It just makes us all, really follow and go for the ESG. And Zarir, Julie, and Pankaj, thanks for introduction. Yeah, so let me come to the point around with one small context, because I'm from a textile industry. While there have been plenty of conversations on why ESG matter in general, I think Zarir also covered quite a bit, changing consumer choices, increasing scrutiny by financial and social community, NGOs. In our case, a lot of NGOs are very active, changing regulations. And we talk about personally the value system, the moral obligation, and if it is pure business, then we say, why can't we actually see value in it and then find incremental value? But I have been previously for 2-3 decades in oil and gas industry, and now I'm in textile and fashion industry. I'm not sure many know this industry is second only in terms of its overall impact on the planet. It generates almost 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, second biggest consumer of water. 20% of all the industrial water pollution is there from this sector. 35% of a global microplastic waste comes from the fossil fuel-based fibers, mostly the polyester nylon. Every second, 1 truckload of clothing is burned or landfilled. So while the clothing, the world is unavoidable and in fact creates instantaneous joy, we realized several years back that global top 2 players in man-made cellulosic fibers, we make fibers from the wood chemistry. We have to lead by being responsible and sustainable fibers ourselves, our company ourselves. And how does it work? I do think purpose is very, very critical. I think that purpose will and should have, beyond making profits, how do you responsibly make profits and make sure the society also improves in it? And then Julie mentioned anchor at the board, embed in the strategy, and also creating that mindset across the organization. So if I come specifically to some of the things that we try to do so far with some success, it's not yet done, and then we have to do more. One is, first of all, if you have a mindset that you have to find all areas, wherever they are, the best-in-class best practices, why can't you bring home and then do something about it? We realized very quickly in terms of emission and waste management, Europe is possibly leading on that front. So we invested almost $200 million to invest in EU BAT guidelines-based emissions and waste management. I think by next year or even year after, we would pretty much be meeting, all our units will be meeting EU BAT guidelines. But on the other hand, you should also have a mindset, I think Zarir touched upon it, is also what is it that we can do where others can emulate across the globe. And we know very much about the sacredness of water. The water is very little. So we focused a lot in terms of water and how do we really reduce water take. It's as I earlier mentioned, textiles is a very second largest consumer of water. So we had considerably reduced the use of water, and we are now, many of our units are now the lowest water intensive units globally. And we've started also tying up with Nagarpalikas to procure water from sewage treatment plants. We intend to take it wherever we have units. We intend to have those kind of arrangements so that we don't use the drinking water that could be otherwise alternatively used elsewhere. And there is a lot of work on innovation, again, something that was touched upon earlier. As I said, there is hardly 1% of the whole consumer textile waste is actually recycled. So we focus on something called Riva Reviva. It's a circular fiber way we use pre-consumer cotton waste and then bring it back and use it in the pulp and make it circular. And the other one is all around digitization. I think, Julie, you mentioned something around demonstrating and showing the transparency in terms of our track and trace systems. Our customers, brands, regulators, NGOs, in our case, Forest Stewardship Council, they are looking for and they are expecting that we demonstrate sustainability credentials. So we developed blockchain-based track and trace system, a physical tracer actually in any from wood to pulp to fiber to yarn to fabric to garment, and eventually goes to the end consumer. It's a physical tracer backed by the blockchain-based backend. We have started that, and we are now going to take it much more as a norm rather than as a specialty. We're spending a lot of time empowering almost 50,000 women by making them financially independent on chosen vocations every year. We have also, because we are in forestry too, so there is forestry in Canada. We also spend a lot of efforts to help farmers in Karnataka. So we offer them saplings, 1 million saplings. So all this, other than what we all have to do or must be already doing, which is around sustainable manufacturing. It's about the kind of energy mix, the renewable part of the fuel that you need to have, process improvements that we need to make, resource conservation that we need to have. So I think I would actually say, Zarir, I think there's a lot we are already doing, possibly when we actually bring all these things together. I think that movement has already started. I'm quite bullish and quite excited. I already start to tell people, Pankaj, that our core business is to achieve excellence in water, waste, emissions management responsibly. And by the way, we also make cellulosic textile fiber. But I want to end by just quoting Mr. Godrej. I think he's particularly said, don't hesitate to do what is right. Don't hesitate to do what is right. Don't hesitate to do what is right. Over to you.
Well said, Kalyan. And I think thank you for bringing out the importance of water management also as part of ESG agenda. And I think very well put in terms of how you are involving the whole supply chain in driving the ESG agenda. It's not just what you do at your company, but it is also important that what we do with the ecosystem that we deal with. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Navneet, all these things, I think, whether they are rewarded by capital markets or not, I think that's the key question. And I think it's important that capital markets also start to play a role in this and reward the companies which are doing good and green. And hence, I think, what is your take on ESG investing? And how is AMC industry evolving around that? And what, according to you, is the way forward?
Thank you, Pankaj. Great to be with all of you this afternoon. I echo the sentiments expressed by everyone. It's very difficult to follow Mr. Godrej. Words of wisdom delivered in such a poetic style. What a prose. So salute to you, sir. And also the inspiring stories of Tata Group and Birla Group in terms of what they are doing on E as well as S. And of course, some of the things that Julie highlighted about what's happening in Europe and what one should expect from organizations. Talking about the ESG investing in India, so of course, it's been picking up in India. I think India is the second largest emerging green bond market after China. And from building renewable power generation to augmenting transmission networks, storage capacity, affordable and green housing to sustainable transportation, I think the overall ESG financing needs are very, very large. Just an example, I mean, the investment required to meet the target of 500 gigawatt capacity by 2030 will itself be more than $300 billion per year till 2030. And so like some of the other countries like China, the scale of opportunity in India is very, very large compared to other countries around the world. Good to note that India ranks number 2 among emerging markets and number 16 or thereabout globally, according to a Bloomberg New Energy Finance report that assesses conditions for energy transition investment. Overall, on the ESG investing on the mutual fund side has been picking up. The investor interest in ESG has been growing. In the last 3 or 4 years, the number of ESG equity funds have grown from 1 or 2 in 2018 to almost 10 now. And ESG assets have grown from $500 million in these funds, in ESG equity funds, to now more than 1.2 or $1.3 billion. So it's an increase of almost 200% in two years. The factors that have contributed is the increased attention and the investor appetite towards ESG. Decent performance of these funds. There is a lower risk perception about ESG investing. But I think we should not look at success of ESG investing only from the money which is collected by or managed by the ESG funds, but how it's getting integrated into the wider ecosystem, how the fund houses are integrating ESG, imbibing ESG in their overall investment process. I think that's a lot more important than than focusing from a very narrow perspective only on the money which is labeled as ESG fund, because at times I think that labeling leads to outcomes which may not be in line with what the national priorities could be, what the societal priorities could be. The regulator has continually been nudging the industry in the right direction to ensure we don't have greenwashing or purpose washing, and that's why I said that those labels alone are not enough. They've actively been supporting the overall, I would say, ESG transition. As everyone knows, SEBI has made it mandatory for the top 1,000 companies to disclose their sustainability work, including the climate risk, social risk, and governance through the BRSR framework. I think this year almost 70 or 75 companies have done this voluntarily. I think a lot of companies from the Tata Group, Godrej Group, Birla Group, ourselves, SDFC, I think we have done it. And I think this will give the wider public a way to kind of assess the kind of reporting Indian companies are doing. And over the years, I think we can keep improvising on that. I think everybody else talked about the importance of technology. I think with the data analytics and the wider ecosystem as it gets developed, I'm sure over a period of time, disclosures will keep improving, which is very critical for ESG investing. The central bank, RBI, is quite committed to mobilize mainstream finance for supporting India's green transition. The government is also actively working on creating a sustainable finance taxonomy for bringing comfort to domestic investors like us and the foreign investors who are keen on ESG or green or sustainable finance. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, good, laid out, the well-defined taxonomy will prevent greenwashing and make it easier for investors to invest, easier to assess portfolios, easier for them to compare one with the other. That will be very critical as well. So the overall supporting ecosystem to enable transparent disclosures, ESG rating, and analytics is evolving well. A lot of organizations in India have got empaneled with the Association of Mutual Fund of India to provide the ESG rating on corporates, which is very, very critical for the asset managers like us. Of course, we have a long way to go on all of these things. So in the fight against climate change and other social challenges, I think businesses are playing a pivotal role with their actions, committing resources, focusing on innovation. And that's why I mentioned that I think the stories that we have heard from Zarir, from Kalyan, and from Mr. Godrej are so impressive. Growing number of companies have announced their net zero ambitions and a formulated transition plan. Good to see the background, Julie, of your carbon negative and net zero by 2025. And I'm sure increasingly, as the Prime Minister has laid out a very, very ambitious vision for India. I mean, he led from the front at Glasgow, and I'm sure he's been leading. Now with the leadership on the G20, I'm sure everybody's looking up to India over the next several years. So companies as well as investors, they no longer see ESG as a mere passing Fed. There's awareness that ESG is a risk mitigation framework that is not only resilient, but that also creates positive long-term value for all stakeholders. I think that realization is very much there. And while Julie talked about, the anchoring the board or embedding into the strategy, going beyond the compliance, we can, in our interaction as investors with Indian corporates, we can clearly see that now it's part of the value system, it's part of their belief system, and no longer a mere, a tick box or a checklist that companies are looking at. So I would say, in conclusion, the progress on ESG is encouraging. Despite the enormity of the challenge before us, before mankind, there is a case for a lot of optimism.
So glad to hear, Navneet, that asset managers and mutual funds are actually taking into consideration the ESG agenda of the companies to choose where to put money. And that will drive real behavioral change. I think three things will drive change: regulation, capital markets, and I think one third element will be in terms of just the realization, as we talked about it, that this is not just good things to do, but I think it is now imperative, as Mr. Godrej pointed out, that there is no choice, but we have to do this. So, Mr.
Also,
Godrej,
I can add, I think as the millennials become or the Gen Z become a more and more important stakeholder as a consumer, when they are buying stuff, they are ensuring what this product is doing to the planet, what it is doing to the future generation, what it's doing to the society, and not only looking at maybe a cheaper price they're looking at very, very differently. And similarly, when they are investing, they are not only looking at what the return it will generate, but they are also looking at what this will do to the future of the planet and future of humanity. So I think they are also driving behavior in a big way, and we must give credit to the younger generation.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I think we are on time now. And just last thing, Mr. Godrej, if you can just take 30 seconds or a minute to talk about how to drive this carbon emissions reduction in faster way, and could a carbon tax or carbon credit drive this change quickly?
It doesn't take a very high carbon price to make it economical to reduce carbon drastically. Perhaps $100 a ton would make a huge difference. In India, we already have certain carbon prices. We have diesel taxes, we have the coal cess, but we need higher taxes. And failing taxes, we need markets. And the government seems to be very serious in setting up a carbon market, and they're approaching industry, and we'll be very willing to work with them to create these markets. If there is either a tax or a market or both, and certain mandates that require us to go to the market, I think we can tackle this problem much faster. And it's very clear that the cost of adaptation is much higher than the cost of prevention. So we shouldn't be looking at adaptation, but prevention.
Very well. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and insights. This was very, very useful, and a lot of learnings and a lot of takeaways from this discussion. Thank you so much.